The Aorus FI32U is here, and it's time to check out what 32-inch 4K 144Hz gaming is all about. Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Yes, today we are checking out the brand new Gigabyte Aorus FI32U, the second ever 32-inch 4K high refresh rate gaming monitor we've had the chance to review. The first one we looked at was the Asus ROG Swift PG32UQX, which, let's be honest, probably isn't going to be on the shopping list of many viewers with an insane price tag of $3,000. The Aorus FI32U is still a high-end monitor, but it's not going to cost you anywhere near that much. And that's because for Gigabyte to hit their targeted price point, they've sacrificed true HDR functionality, instead settling for a crappy display HDR 400, which, as we all know, really doesn't lead to proper HDR at all. So there's no full array local dimming here, no mini LED backlights, just your regular old, largely SDR setup, which has led to thousands of dollars being shaved off the price tag relative to the PG32UQX. But for many people, Gigabyte better balancing the price to performance ratio is a good thing. The FI32U still packs quite an attractive spec list with a 32-inch 4K 144Hz IPS panel and adaptive sync support through AMD FreeSync Premium Pro, although it also works just fine on NVIDIA GPUs and with console variable refresh rates as well, thanks to the inclusion of HDMI 2.1. Gigabyte are claiming here a 1 millisecond response time for furious speed and 90% DCI-P3 coverage too. As for pricing, Gigabyte are slapping a $1,000 price tag on the FI32U, which does seem pricey in comparison to their new M28U, which launched recently at $600 with a smaller 28-inch size and similar specs. But it's also not $3,000 like the PG32UQX, so it's hard to complain too much about dropping full HDR support and saving $2,000 in the process. With that pricing information in mind, I guess one question that immediately comes up is, should I get a 27-inch 4K monitor or a 32-inch 4K monitor? This is largely going to be a personal preference thing, and the amount of space you have will also be a consideration, but for me, I do prefer the larger 32-inch format for 4K gaming. I think it's more immersive, the pixel density of 4K at 32 inches is still excellent, so you're still getting all the benefits of sharp text and imagery, but it's also not too large. While lower resolutions are perhaps a little better at smaller display sizes, I think that 32 inches is the sweet spot for 4K gaming at a normal desk setup. As an Aorus monitor, the FI32U uses similar styling to Gigabyte's previous displays. It has an angular metal stand that I think looks quite good. However, the rear isn't subtle to say the least. You get RGB LED illuminated light bars and an illuminated Aorus logo in addition to the sort of angles and patterns that, for some reason, come with these high-end gaming displays. The RGB lights really aren't bright enough to create an ambient light effect, so they're pretty useless in my opinion. Now, I don't think the monitor looks bad from the rear by any means, and it's not like you'll see it most of the time. I'm just more of a fan of simpler designs. One thing that's hard to complain about though is the build quality, which overall is very good. Nice tight seams, metal stand legs, decent quality plastic. It does look like a premium product, which has been the case with past Aorus monitors as well. The range of adjustability is excellent with all of height, tilt, swivel and pivot support included, and of course there is VESA mounting support too. As for ports, we're looking at one DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC in addition to two HDMI 2.1 ports and some USB ports including USB Type-C. Both DisplayPort and HDMI support the full 4K 144Hz experience, although you will need the latest GPUs from NVIDIA or AMD to access the highest refresh rate over HDMI 2.1. Gigabyte continues to impress with the features included with their monitors. The FI32U includes active noise cancellation, a KVM switch, and lots of OSD features such as their OSD sidekick, crosshairs, and so on. While I personally don't use many of these features regularly, a lot of them are kind of neat bonuses, especially things like the KVM, if you have a setup that would benefit from one. Diving right into response time performance next, and we'll start with the off mode at 144Hz, the first of 4 overdrive settings. This does appear to be overdrive disabled, revealing the panel's native performance with no overshoot. We're seeing a 10 millisecond response time on average, although cumulative deviation of 644 is decent, all things considered. The picture quality mode is the ideal mode for gaming at 144Hz. While there is more overshoot using this mode than the off mode, response times have decreased significantly to the point where the average is just 4.57 milliseconds in this mode. This has caused a reduction in cumulative deviation, suggesting that while there is some overshoot, the balance here means response times are closer to ideal than in the prior mode. With refresh compliance of 98%, this is the mode that I would use for gaming at the highest refresh rate. The bounce mode pushes things too far in the direction of overshoot. Response times do improve, but with an inverse ghosting rate of 60%, there are noticeable bright trails following moving objects while gaming. Similar with the speed mode, which is even more ridiculous with its overshoot. At no stage does this monitor really produce a 1 millisecond response time, though of course, even if it could, the chances of significant overshoot were always high with an IPS LCD at that sort of speed. Unfortunately, the FI32U does not deliver a single overdrive mode experience. At higher refresh rates, the picture quality mode is preferred as it does produce a clearer image. However, below 100Hz there's quite a lot of inverse ghosting, so for more mid to low refresh rate gaming, this mode isn't tuned very well. Conversely, the off mode is too slow at 144Hz with low refresh rate compliance, but has far less overshoot, effectively a zero error rate, when the refresh rate drops below 100Hz. For this reason, the off mode is preferred for lower refresh rate gaming. It's really hard to pick a balanced set and forget mode here because each setting is so different. I'd tend towards the picture quality mode for most use cases, but those with less powerful GPUs that will be gaming at lower refresh rates should go for off. It's too hard to split. To be honest, with a high-end monitor, this isn't really good enough. I expect a single overdrive mode experience when paying $1,000 for a monitor, so in this case, variable overdrive should be used. Now, Gigabyte do provide a smart OD feature, but it's not very smart, almost never picking the correct overdrive setting, and instead defaulting to what appears to be bounce mode in a lot of situations. In comparison to other monitors, the FI32U delivers okay results at the highest 144Hz refresh rate it can do. Performance is similar to the M28U, but not as good, with both slower response times and higher overshoot to a small degree. We're also seeing better performance than a panel like the Acer Predator X27, and in good news for buyers that avoided the PG32UQX due to its high price tag, the FI32U is also quite a bit faster than it. However, on average, the lack of an overdrive setting between off and picture quality, or the lack of variable overdrive, leads to weak results. While the average response time is decent on average across the refresh range from 144 to 60Hz, the level of overshoot is too high relative to its competitors. The M28U has noticeably lower inverse ghosting at a similar response time average, and I think the M28U has really good overdrive settings. With the balance of response times and overshoot leaning too far into the overshoot category, the FI32U has weak cumulative deviation compared to the best IPS monitors of today. The M28U and ASUS VG28UQL1A are 15 to 20% better in this metric, so there is a bit of a performance penalty choosing this larger panel size, which I believe is an Innolux panel versus a smaller equivalent. With that said, the FI32U is still superior to last generation panels like the X27 or Nixius NX EDG 274K, and it comfortably beats the PG32UQX in motion clarity with 34% better cumulative deviation. I should also note here that cumulative deviation isn't significantly changed when using the off mode, it just shifts the balance from high overshoot to slower response times. The FI32U sees its best performance in higher refresh rates. Again, at 120Hz it's not amazing relative to other top-end IPS monitors with its noticeably high level of overshoot, but this sort of refresh rate with these settings is still playable with not too many artifacts. However, at 60Hz you really should reduce the overdrive setting to off, which sees far weaker response times in the region of the PG32UQX and several other older monitors. The M28U or VG28UQL1A are far better choices for 60Hz gaming, and even they aren't sort of the best options in this chart. On a more positive note, the FI32U has decent input lag for a 144Hz display, falling into the middle of this chart and only really beaten by higher refresh rate offerings. A processing delay of less than 1 millisecond is excellent. However, I should note here that we tested the FI32U calibrated with local dimming disabled. If you choose to leave local dimming enabled, and it is enabled by default, input lag is around 10 milliseconds slower, which is bad for gaming, and the local dimming implementation isn't great anyway, so you probably should just disable it. Fixed 60Hz input lag is also slower, though more around the 5 millisecond processing delay, which isn't too bad. Power consumption is on the higher side, but not as high as the PG32UQX, which makes sense as the mini LED backlight in that monitor is generally going to suck down more power. However, power consumption pales in comparison to LG's 48-inch OLED. The FI32U does support backlight strobing through aim stabilizer sync, so like other recent Gigabyte monitors, you can use this feature either with or without adaptive sync variable refresh rates, and with refresh rates between 80 and 144 Hz. It appears to perform similarly whether adaptive sync is enabled or disabled, making it one of the better implementations of this technology. For the most part, aim stabilizer sync does improve motion clarity and produces a clearer image. However, it doesn't seem to work as well as the best Gigabyte monitors I've tested with this feature. There was still some blur and some strobe crosstalk, particularly outside the golden center zone of the display. There are also no settings to tweak strobe length or timing, so the mode lacks fine control. I also noticed some red fringing at times, which is typical for this sort of backlight. On top of this, quality gets worse as the refresh rate decreases with more crosstalk around that 80 Hz range, so it's probably worth experimenting with this feature to see if you like it, but for this monitor, I think it could use a bit more fine tuning. Moving on to color quality, and from this gamut chart we do see a wide color gamut, but a low wide gamut if that makes sense. DCI-P3 coverage is only registering in at 86%, which isn't sufficient for color critical work in that gamut. We also don't see any meaningful coverage of Adobe RGB, which is stronger in the green spectrum. Overall, Rec 2020 coverage is higher than just having an sRGB or Rec 709 only display, but lower than the best IPS monitors I've tested. My FI32U unit shipped with average factory calibration. Gigabyte appear to be calibrating for a flat 2.2 gamma, but kinda missed the mark somewhat, although the color balance wasn't too bad with only a slight grain tint out of the box. This led to mid-range delta E results. Meanwhile, for saturation and color checker tests, the FI32U doesn't ship with an sRGB gamut clamp enabled by default, so there is some oversaturation. But the limited wide gamut nature of this panel means the oversaturation level isn't too bad. This leads to better than expected delta E's for color tests. In comparison to other monitors, as mentioned, the grayscale results are mid-range, and it doesn't look like Gigabyte have paid a heap of attention to making the display perfect. Meanwhile, for color checker accuracy, the FI32U is the best of this group of wide gamut monitors, but it falls short of displays like the PG32UQX that come with their sRGB mode enabled by default. I should note here that I tested factory calibration after disabling local dimming, as I immediately found it annoying and distracting, and I suspect many other people will also choose to disable it straight away for SDR usage. The FI32U does come with an sRGB mode, though it unnecessarily disables a bunch of settings like white balance control, so that limits its usefulness. Grayscale performance is slightly different to the regular mode, but remains inaccurate, while color performance improves by a few notches as the sRGB gamut clamp does work as advertised. Your other option for improving accuracy using OSD settings is to optimize the white balance outside the sRGB mode, but this won't provide an adequate gamut clamp. The OSD settings I used are shown here. After a calibration pass using DisplayCal, and Patreon and Floatplane members can download the ICC profile we created, performance does improve substantially for sRGB content, and any lingering issues with grayscale are resolved. However, I still wouldn't recommend the FI32U if you need a monitor for DCI-P3 or Adobe RGB productivity work, as its limited wide gamut support leads to some inaccuracies at times. Ideally, you'd want over 95% coverage of those color spaces, which some of the top monitors do provide, but this monitor doesn't. Brightness in the SDR mode is acceptable at approximately 360 nits, which judging by this chart is a level that a lot of manufacturers feel comfortable with. HDR brightness is a little higher at a touch over 400 nits, so I'm not quite sure why the SDR brightness range is limited given several other monitors happily do over 400 nits in SDR. Minimum brightness also decent at 46 nits. The contrast ratio I recorded was a bit disappointing. We measure contrast ratios after calibration, and basically my unit dropped from a contrast ratio of slightly over 1000 to 1 uncalibrated to around 900 to 1 calibrated, which as you can see is one of the weaker results. IPS monitors already have poor contrast ratios relative to VA and especially OLED technologies, so I'm not a fan of a contrast ratio this low, and it does impact the experience for those that like to game in dark rooms. With that said, contrast is acceptable for brighter conditions. Viewing angles are great. I don't think you'll find too many complaints there, as this is a nice flat IPS panel with great viewability. As for uniformity, pretty good with my unit, although a keen eye probably would have noticed a slight color tone difference between the bottom left and upper right sides. IPS glow is minimal, although this does vary between units. A quick final word on HDR. The FI32U is a display HDR 400 certified monitor. However, it lacks the necessary hardware for a true HDR experience. Firstly, the monitor doesn't get bright enough, topping out around 430 nits, which is insufficient for bright HDR highlights, especially on an LCD. Secondly, it lacks full array local dimming. Now there are 16 edge-lit dimming zones here, which is better than 0 dimming zones, but this type of dimming technology typically leads to either huge amounts of blooming or just an always activated backlight in real-world content. The FI32U has bad HDR, and I wouldn't consider this a selling point at all. You're better off thinking of it as a pure SDR monitor. Overall, I think it's fair to say I have mixed feelings about Gigabyte's Aorus FI32U. There are some aspects here that I like, such as the large 32-inch 4K 144Hz panel, and other aspects to the hardware offering, such as HDMI 2.1. But I also feel it's just that bit lacking as a high-end monitor, missing some features and fine-tuning that I would expect when forking over $1,000. Take response times as an example. The monitor performs quite well at 144Hz. The IPS panel Gigabyte are using here is no slouch, and their backlight strobing tech can improve clarity at times. However, in not implementing variable overdrive and only offering a limited selection of overdrive settings, the FI32U ends up not offering a set and forget single overdrive mode experience, which hurts variable refresh gaming. This monitor is either fast enough at high refresh rates but with too much inverse ghosting at low refresh rates, or too slow at high refreshes but with no overshoot at lower refreshes. Most other displays in this price tier fix this problem and have better optimized overdrive. It's similar in color performance as well. As an IPS panel, we get some really great qualities, great viewing angles, great text clarity, a nice flat panel that does a good job of handling reflections. But factory calibration is no different to Gigabyte's lower end displays. The level of wide gamut support is mediocre, which limits its use as a creator display, and there's nothing particularly amazing about brightness or contrast. Throw in poor HDR that's basically not worth having, and there's definitely room for improvement there as well. Some of these things might sound like nitpicks, and yes, normally I wouldn't think they are anything too serious when discussing mid-range or lower-end monitors. But with the FI32U, I look at the price tag of $1,000 US or 1,600 Australian dollars and feel a little disappointed with the attention to detail. Everything except the resolution and refresh rate seems more to me like a mid-range monitor, with a few features like ANC and a KVM thrown in. I don't think this display is quite at the level of justifying its high price tag at this stage, and I'd rather see a discount before purchasing. This is also one of a few 32-inch 4K 144Hz non-HDR monitors that are hitting the market over the next few months, so there will be plenty of competition to choose from, and we're hoping to assess some other options on the channel soon. It might turn out that the FI32U is the best of the bunch, but I'd rather hold out to make sure before handing over $1,000 of my cash. Anyway, that's it for this review. If you're interested in supporting our monitor testing, then please consider buying some of our hardware unavailable merch. Links to those are in the description below. We also have our Patreon and Floatplane accounts if you want to gain access to things like our ICC profiles, our Discord chat, monthly live streams, behind the scenes videos, all that good stuff. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.